So you may have heard the saying, what solves homelessness? A home. Is it that simple? Is it true? My name is Brittany Page. This is the Page Perspective. Thank you so much for joining me today. You may see that I am dressed very on brand for the conversation that we are having today. This is available, if you like this shirt, at dollamore.info. It is from the Dollamore merch store. So if you like the shirt, that's where you can get it. Very on brand for the topic today, though, homelessness. Before we get into it, please remember to subscribe. I have said it a few times. About half of the views that I get are from channels that are not actually subscribed. It would be amazing if we could get over 20,000 subscribers before the end of the new year. Do you think that's achievable? I think so. I think we can do it. Thank you for all the likes, the comments, the phone calls, the emails. It has been amazing. I love hearing from smart, passionate people. So thank you so much for joining these conversations with me. And I hope you'll do the same on this topic today. So listen, it's a big thing. It's a big topic. We're not going to be able to cover everything, but I want you to walk away from this video with the basic message that our society has the ability to dramatically reduce homelessness if we expand access to affordable housing. And that's the primary thing. This isn't a controversial take among experts and researchers, but for some reason, it's difficult for elected leaders of even both parties and just the general public to tie the rates of homelessness to a lack of affordable housing in this country. And I've talked about this recently with New York City Mayor Eric Adams and his plan, his terrible plan, his inhumane plan to involuntarily hospitalize people who are mentally ill, living on the streets, even if they pose no risk to other people. And I have repeatedly called that effort what it is, what I believe it to be, which is just to remove visible poverty from the streets. I also recently talked about Fox News, Jesse Watters and Gregg being extremely cruel, talking about people who are unhoused, which is something that you would expect to see on Fox News. And a lot of the arguments when it comes to explaining why people are unhoused often come down to like blaming people for their individual choices. You may hear people talk about that, someone has a mental health problem, or they have an addiction, or they lost a job, or they didn't plan well with their finances. People often go to these individual choices that people have made to explain why someone is homeless. And sure, individual choices certainly play a role in why someone might be homeless. But an important question to ask is why we see such a large disparity when it comes to rates of homelessness based on location. And by that, I mean, why do we see more rates of homelessness, a higher rate of homelessness in DC or New York City compared to like West Virginia or Wisconsin? And that is because of the price of housing, the availability of affordable housing. That's the primary thing we're going to be talking about today. And more Americans are actually worried about the affordability of housing. And according to Pew Research Center, about half of Americans, 49%, say the availability of affordable housing in their local community is a major problem. And that is up 10 percentage points from early 2018. This is from a Pew Research Center survey conducted in 2021. So a growing number of Americans are concerned about the lack of available, affordable housing in their area. Why isn't this translating into an understanding that this lack of affordable housing in our communities is playing a role in homelessness? Well, two researchers, Gregg, Colburn and Clayton Page Aldern, are on the case. They are the authors of the book Homelessness Is a Housing Problem: How Structural Factors Explain U.S. Patterns. Now, in this book, they argue that housing market conditions like the cost of housing or the availability of housing, that these are major drivers of homelessness, and that rates of homelessness cannot be explained by substance use, poverty rates, or even rates of mental illness. And the main question that they asked in their research is why? Why do homelessness rates vary so much across the country? And in this chart, chart, you can see high rates of homelessness in DC, New York City, San Francisco, and Boston, with lower rates in Chicago and Indianapolis. So they wanted to know why. Why does this disparity exist? Now, somewhat surprisingly, they find that areas with higher rates of poverty actually have lower rates of homelessness. As you can see here, where the y-axis on the side is rates of homelessness per 1,000 people, and the x-axis at the bottom is the percent with income below the poverty level. Now, the researchers know this may be counterintuitive, right? But it's useful to compare, let's say, Detroit and San Francisco. In Detroit, you are going to see higher rates of poverty in that city, but you're going to see lower rates of homelessness in that city when compared to San Francisco, where you're going to have higher rates of homelessness and lower rates of poverty. So what is explaining that? And that's what they're trying to get to with these disparities between these cities. And they find a similar thing when you look at mental illness. When we look at this graph for mental illnesses, the researchers illustrate a similar pattern. There are not higher rates of mental illness in areas where there are high rates of homelessness. Now, this does not mean that poverty, mental illness are not risk factors for homelessness. They go out of their way to say that these things are not risk factors. They can be risk factors for homelessness, but they talk about them as precipitating events to homelessness. That if you experience poverty, if you experience mental illness, if you have a substance use problem, that in the context of living in a city where you do not have access to affordable housing, you are going to be more likely to experience homelessness when you have those issues, poverty, mental illness, or substance abuse, because of the lack of access to affordable housing. Now let's get into that a little bit, specifically from a recent article that they wrote. That's not to suggest that poverty or mental illness aren't risk factors for losing your housing. Certainly, the lower your income, the higher your chance of experiencing homelessness. It would be strange if that weren't the case. We prefer to think of these factors as precipitating events that may lead to losing one's housing, but the conditions have to be right for these risks to be realized as such. The point is that these individual vulnerabilities, which are clearly risk factors for homelessness, have different consequences in different locations. The consequence of being poor in Seattle, for example, is very different than in Cleveland. So things like mental illness, drug addiction, those are risk factors for homelessness. But whether someone who is experiencing a mental illness or experiencing a substance use disorder, whether they end up homeless is largely going to depend upon their access to affordable housing and the area in which they live. So when we look to these individual explanations about why someone is unhoused, they're not particularly useful, and research is finding that they are not the primary driver of why someone is homeless. It is more related to their access to affordable housing and the availability of affordable housing in their area. So those individual circumstances may make someone more vulnerable to being unhoused, but we're talking about where they live, the cost of living in their area, the vacancy rate of housing in their area, just the availability of affordable housing in general. Those are far more important factors to look at in this conversation. And I want to talk about an article that I came across in The Atlantic this month, written by Jerusalem Demzas, and she started the article in a powerful way. When someone becomes homeless, the instinct is to ask what tragedy befell them. What bad choices did they make with drugs or alcohol? What prevented them from getting a higher paying job? Why did they have more children than they could afford? Why didn't they make rent? Identifying personal failures or specific tragedies helps those of us who have homes feel less precarious. If homelessness is about personal failure, it's easier to dismiss as something that couldn't happen to us. And harsh treatment is easier to rationalize toward those who experience it. So let's work on that, right? Let's recognize that tendency that we may have to ask questions about how someone ended up in a particular situation because we have fear, because we want to protect ourselves from the feeling that maybe that could be us. And maybe it's useful to participate in an exercise where we think, could that be me? I mean, after all, we are all closer to being unhoused than we are to being Elon Musk. And I think the reason that we're overestimating the role of poverty, mental illness, substance use in causing something like homelessness is because the people that we think of as the homeless are the people that we likely come into contact with when we are in a big city that are living on the street. We don't think about the families, the individuals who are living in a motel, who are living in their car, who are living in a shelter, trying as hard as they can to find their way back to stability. We don't think about those examples. We think about the ones that Fox News is playing on a loop. So what do we do here? I think that we listen to the research and we make more room in our thinking for the factor that is lack of affordable housing in resulting in homelessness. And if there is no affordable housing in your area, or there's push to create more affordable housing in your area, I would recommend that you support those efforts, that you support the funding, that you support and show up and say, yes, we need to build, we need to fund affordable housing in this community. And beware of solutions that just seek to remove visible poverty from the streets, because that's not actually solving any kind of problem. And we want solutions here. And it's going to be a while before we can get there. But if we're actively working on supporting access to affordable housing, supporting housing for all, we will get to a great place in society, I believe. What do you think? Call, let me know, 657-464-7609, or you can email idoubtit@dollamore.com. You can also support on Patreon, patreon.com/idoubtitpodcast. Look for upcoming announcements on me activating my channel memberships. Now that I am monetized, I can have channel memberships. And coming up after the new year, I'm going to be launching that and describing what all that will entail. In the meantime, you can support by watching, by liking, by subscribing, by sharing with a friend and telling a friend to subscribe. And of course, Patreon is an important way. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being passionate about these issues and furthering the conversation in the comments. I will see you next time.